Hi guys, welcome back to the Black Iron Brothers podcast. This is episode 5. 5.
See that?
We're deep in it now.
Deep in the juju.
Deep in the juju. So this episode is going to be about exercise selection. So I know a lot of people who are relatively new to training don't necessarily know where to place their exercises, which exercises are best.
What order?
What order, when should they do them, how often should they do them, all that kind of stuff. So we're going to try and go over that a little bit today. The first thing that we're going to basically go over is the order in which your exercises should go. Should typically go from a compound or a multi-joint movement and heading towards what we would call a isolation movement.
Single joint movements.
Yeah. So we're basically talking about going from something like if we're talking about a pushing movement, for example, we could go from a bench press and then into a lighter variation on that, into accessory assistance movements. We'll go into that in a moment, but basically what we mean by this is going from big, heavy, difficult movements and then going into lighter, easier movements as we go through the workout. So for the sake of simplicity here, we're going to use 3 terms: primary, accessory, and assistance exercises here for today. There are different definitions. People will use different terms.
It's kind of interchangeable, the last two sometimes.
Yeah, so don't overly worry about that too much, but basically a primary movement would be your biggest movement. Again, we're going to use the example here of just like a bench press would be a primary movement. Really big movement using multiple joints.
Yeah, sort of max weight.
Maximum weight, yeah. And we will then transition from that into what would be called an accessory lift. So an accessory lift would be something like a close grip. What are other examples?
Or a Larsen, so like you take your legs out of the bench press, anything like that kind
Potentially an incline bench as well. That's getting a little bit further away, but it's still very similar. Still very similar.
Biomechanically, very similar.
And that's what we're going to refer to here as far as an accessory lift. Yes, it's still a big compound movement, but it's probably lighter because of the fact that you can't lift as much because
so like
you're modifying.
The angle means your shoulders will be taking more of the brunt of it. So typically, not with maybe like you, because you're a strong
quite
man,
good at incline, yeah.
But with most people, flat pressing will be stronger, so you would taper it down into an accessory with an incline bench.
Yeah.
Not if you're a strong man though, really.
And then we're going to go into something that we call assistance. So that would be your even smaller movement. So that would be something that isn't necessarily copying the movement, but that's something that's going to assist in building muscle and getting more proficient at that movement. So that could be, for example, if we're talking about a bench press, again, we could be talking about your tricep movements, your shoulder movements, your chest movements. So that could be like flies. It could be like a chest fly. It could be, lat raises if your shoulders are weak, tricep extensions, all these kind of movements that are going to basically bring up the musculature of the movements. Bring up the musculature surrounding that movement. So that
anything that would help
bring it up a little bit.
The 2 above categories. So anything that would help your accessories get better, and anything that would help your primaries get better.
Yeah.
Would be your assistance.
Yeah.
So the reason we do this, and the reason we prioritize our multi-joint movements first, is because we can typically achieve higher stimulation through higher loads, right? So we can have higher intensity, more progressive overload from those primary movements. Yeah. If you think about it as you've got like a certain amount of battery in you, right? So if we start with the primaries, we can have our battery is full. We can put our most effort into that. If we started with like a cable fly and we're doing loads and loads of sets of that, not only would it be dangerous in the fact that we'd have to do such a heavy weight on a relatively compromising position in terms of if it was extreme load, it just would become like the longer the workout went on, it become least efficacious as you went on. Yeah. So like you always lead with the higher intensity movements, and that's because these elicit more hypertrophy and more strength adaptations. Yeah. So the more load you can have on a particular movement, and the more it stimulates the growth of muscle, the more strength, everything like that will come along.
Now, that's not to say that depending on your goals, for example, like if you're looking more at strength and hypertrophy, definitely bench press would be a good option if we're talking about pushing. But, for example, if we're just purely talking about a bodybuilder, for example, they're still going to work on the larger multi-joint compound movements, but it might not necessarily for them be a bench press. What it may be for them is like a heavy chest press. It's a machine
or like
chest
a
press.
Smith machine press.
Or a Smith machine press.
But it's still the same movement pattern.
It's the same movement pattern, and it's also going from, again, that really heavy movement towards the lighter one.
They just take away a tiny bit of the the stability.
Yeah,
The
they
instabilities.
they don't have to worry about stability as much because they're locked into that.
So they're dialing into a particular muscle group.
So for a bodybuilder, that might be preferable, but to each goal, a different exercise may be selected.
But potentially for overall development and for general population, you want to have more of those free weight movements in there because it will develop your physique as a whole with the stability to perform all movements.
Yeah. And we've certainly seen a lot of guys who have, like, I definitely have with clients who are like, oh, I'm great at bench. And I'm like, well, what do you mean? And they've only ever done Smith machine. And then you put them onto a normal bench press and they're all over the place.
Unfortunately, the Smith machine doesn't weigh 20 kilos.
It does not. It weighs nothing, essentially.
It doesn't weigh 20 kilos.
Yeah, it weighs a few,
think it does,
it weighs a few kilos.
Yeah.
And they're like, oh, I'm doing 100. You're doing 80.
Maybe 4, but go up to your Smith machine in the gym, take all the weight off, and I guarantee you could pick it up with your pinky finger.
Yeah.
If you do that with an Olympic bar, you're a gangster.
Now, that's not to say that there's anything wrong with those movements, but if we are talking about, like, getting as much from those movements as possible, as much bang for your buck, I think is what we were thinking about this.
Yeah.
Is, with something like a bench press with a barbell, I'm still using the same example here, but we could use everything. We could use squats, deadlifts, all these kind of different movements. But with the example of a bench press, if we're using a barbell, you have to stabilize in that movement. And that's going to be super useful for anyone, especially if they're learning how to do the movement, to be able to learn how to stabilize.
But also, we're stabilizing muscles as well,
Yeah.
which all the little small idiosyncrasies in there of each different compounding factor, they all get stronger.
And that kind of leads us on to the next thing where we're talking about stability. And, there is a massive amount of people within the industry who do things that we would call functional or unstable exercises.
Whereas everything is functional.
Everything's functional depending on your goals. If you're doing it in the right way, it's functional. Now, the issue with some of the more unstable movements, and you'll see a lot of people doing weird kind of like single leg with banded added resistance, where they're doing like a curl plus a lunge with a Bosu ball kind of thing. And it's like, you necessarily, because of the nature of that movement, have to reduce the intensity of that movement. You have to reduce the load of the movement.
Normally they're so unstable that you have to reduce it exponentially.
Yeah.
So it's a huge amount of reduction.
More so than if you were even to do it just as like a lunge or whatever.
Exactly.
Because you're adding that extra element of instability through a Bosu ball or whatever, it's making it even more difficult. So you have to use very minimal weight, and the issue with that is what it eventually causes is, you will not actually really need any adaptation. Your body won't force adaptation. And what we have to do, your body does not really like to grow muscle. You have to force adaptation. It takes a lot of energy, exactly. So you have to force adaptation, and it won't just happen. So doing very unstable exercises have also been shown in studies to not be that useful.
Yeah, the principle behind it is that they're going to strengthen your ligaments and tendons and the connections of your muscles, all that kind of stuff, and help prevent injury. Whereas in reality, the more static exercises, free weights are still considered in the sort of static exercises, they strengthen your tendons far more and your ligaments far more, all of your connective tissues, because of the massive disparity between the loads you can use. Right? If you're doing a single leg Romanian deadlift on an unstable surface with a band pulling the knee laterally, there's going to be a tiny amount of weight compared to, say, someone who can do a strict RDL with 220 kilos. Who's going to have the stronger hamstring tendons and everything like that? It's just one of those things.
That person who can use more maximal load is probably going to have much tougher tendons and ligaments than that person who's done really light stuff.
Because they can handle that tension.
And that's not to dismiss the value of plyometric movements or whatever.
No.
But it is to say that they are somewhat second to those much larger movements if we're talking in the context of trying to get stronger.
Well, it's more that they conflate those aforementioned things with sports-specific movements like plyometric movements, but they're still somewhat stable. They're just trying to, they just imitate the movements of sport, but all these things where you add loads of superfluous pieces of equipment, it's more of a gimmick than it is actually aiding you in your sport. You're going to get a lot of it from just sport-specific movements without.
We're looking at you, Joel Seedman. We're looking at you, Joel Seedman. Look him up if you want to look at silly exercises.
But admitted to doing 80% of the primary movements first in the last thing.
So he's either lying. Or anyway, we're going really into the industry stuff. But anyway, go look up Joel Seedman. Some interesting stuff is happening. Anyway, what that leads us to is now actually exercise selection in general. Which movements should you be doing? And more importantly, instead of which exercises, which movement patterns should you be doing?
So if you do all of these movement patterns, you will become strong in sort of almost every plane.
Yeah.
Yeah. So these are the ones that you need to be hitting at least once a week, preferably
twice if you can. Yeah.
Maybe 3 with the small.
And also depending on level of your level of training, you might not necessarily be able to hit those twice a week, but if you're starting out, and probably even intermediate lifters can manage twice.
So the more novel you are to training, the more you can, and the more experience, the less.
Yeah. So basically, those movements are going to be a hip hinge, which is massively important, and I always advocate people do some form of hip hinge movement, and you'll see almost every athlete in whatever different discipline doing some form of hip hinge. And what that means is some form of deadlift, really. Now, it can be other forms, but typically a hip hinge is a deadlift.
Yeah, they normally say the deadlift or Romanian deadlift, they might say.
Deadlift or Romanian deadlift.
But they're not.
But that is your main hip hinged movement. The next one is a knee flexion or extension. So, I say knee flexion and extension. And that basically just means bending the knee, straightening the knee. And that basically means the leg bending and then straightening. And then what that would be is essentially a squat. Now, again, we could be talking, if we're talking about bodybuilding, for example, we could be talking about a leg press or a hack squat. That would be absolutely fine.
Yep.
But within the conditions of trying to potentially add more stability and stuff like that,
and more strength.
A barbell would probably be preferable to us.
Because
doesn't mean that it's better for everyone.
Yeah.
But like a barbell squat is definitely
if
a
it
great
was
choice.
solely muscle, you could argue the leg press and the hack squat.
Yeah.
But in terms of, if you want the combination of the two, strength and muscle, which people typically want, especially when starting out building that foundation, you'd probably go for more of like a barbell squat.
Do you want to mention the next ones?
So in terms of, we're looking at push movements, you want to make sure that you're hitting one in the horizontal plane and one in the vertical plane. Yeah, so horizontal plane, we're looking like we've mentioned before, a bench press, and in the vertical plane, you're talking like an overhead press or a push press, log, all those kind of things that you do. If we're talking pulling, it's very much the same thing. Yeah, so you want to do a horizontal pull and a vertical pull. So a vertical pull could be the great classic one. People argue whether it's effective, but reality is it's one of the best out there. Pull-ups.
Yeah, pull-ups.
Any
amazing
variation of.
exercise,
If you get pain in any different one, you can literally manipulate your hands and it will completely change the movement. But that essential movement is great.
It could be pull down as well, though. Like a lat pull down is definitely an option. I would probably put that lower as far as the value of building strength in that plane of movement. But if we're talking about just getting a good neural connection, for example, a lat pull down is certainly a great option.
But you'd probably put that in more of the accessory category rather than the primary.
Yes. So accessory or even in fact assistance, because it's just more about building that
You're
muscle.
locked into it. You get the support of your legs being caged in, so you can pull more weight.
So the horizontal pull as well that you kind of mentioned there, a row is going to be massively important. There's a lot of people like, for example, Brian Allsrue, who's a really high-level strongman. I think he was an American record holder at one point. And he advocates multiple times a week doing some form of bent over row. Now,
he loves bent over
that could be a bit, and I really like them as well. They are quite fatiguing for your system because you're holding isometrically, which means your hip is hinged isometrically.
They can affect your hip hinge movement.
Yeah, and it means that your deadlift could suffer a little bit from that, but that heavy row is going to be so beneficial for you in so many ways. Now, it doesn't have to be a bent over row. It could be a T-bar row. It could be a dumbbell row.
Seal row.
So many different options as far as what row you could be doing, but it's going to be another really, really important movement to be applying
Always
into your
need
program.
a horizontal row in there.
Yeah, and put it in regularly. It does it again in all of your pull workouts. You probably should be having some kind of row movement.
And often they just say the sort of rule of thumb would be, if you've got 2 pull workouts in your week, is that you prioritise vertical pulls on one and you prioritise horizontal pulls on the other.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good way of sort of arranging it there. So you're not only prioritising certain movements.
Yeah.
Keeps you more balanced.
The last one as well is a unilateral leg movement as well. So I would generally always put into a client's program some form of unilateral movement. That would either be, if you're really, really new to training, I have some older clients, for example, who cannot do even like a split squat. Well, they're going to do a supported split squat. They're going to be hanging on to something and, making it easier by holding on and then dropping into that split squat movement. But as you progress...
Smith machine. You could do a Smith machine split squat.
Exactly. There's so many variations that you can be doing. When people tell me, I can't do lunges because my knees hurt, it's typically because you're trying to do something that's too tough for you at the time.
But it's essentially any form of lunge.
Yeah, so a lunge, a Bulgarian split squat as well, is going to be a unilateral movement. So these are all going to be really useful for hip health, knee health, ankle health, and also just like stability movements as well in general. Really, really useful.
Being able to move under load.
Yeah. So just to finish on the point that you were making there, as far as putting a vertical pull or a horizontal pull into your workout wherever in your week, know that you should probably have both each time you're hitting that in the week, but you're going to have one that's going to be more dominant and one that's lesser. But that means that you could probably hit it still more in the week. So I will say this, for example, if I'm doing a leg workout, I'm going to probably have a quad dominant workout with a little bit of hamstring at the end, and then a big hamstring workout with a little bit of quad at the end. Now, not everyone necessarily has to do this, but if we're talking
recoverability as
well,
yeah.
But again, if we're talking about frequency and we don't want to just do hamstrings or just do quads, and we do want to still tap that muscle, it would be useful to add in a little bit, like one exercise.
Yeah, to hit that 2 times a week threshold.
Yeah, to just still get that threshold of 2 times a week.
Yeah, especially if you're, again, like we said, the newer you are to training, the more you can hit.
Yeah. So just to finish here, really, the main thing that we want to remember here as far as your exercise selection is that it's going to be entirely dependent on your sport and entirely dependent on your individual goals. Now, whatever a strongman is doing, a powerlifter is doing, a weightlifter, they are all going to be different primary movements.
Yeah. Whatever your primary goal is in your sport, that will be the primary movement.
Yeah, and that's what should probably come first in your workout.
That will help. That's the easy way to remember it. Yeah. What's your primary goal? My prime movements are all going to be there.
Yeah. So for a powerlifter, that would be your squat, bench, deadlift.
Yeah.
For a strongman, that could be your yoke, or it could be, a log press, for example, or a heavy deadlift.
Atlas stones.
Atlas stones.
The cool one.
Well, I mean, typically Atlas stones actually is the exception, because often it comes at the end of a competition. Typically people are going to train.
But if you want it to be amazing.
But if you wanted to be as the rule of specificity is, if you wanted to be the best at Atlas stones, you would start with Atlas stones. So that's a very good point to finish with there. Yeah.
Himself.
To be like Atlas himself, yeah. So just bear in mind that all of those primary movements for your goals are what come first, and then everything else as far as your accessory movements and your assistance movements, that is organised around those primary movements. But the goal should be to organise it all around what is the most important to you and what are your priorities.
It's a pyramid. It's a pyramid.
It's a pyramid.
Primary at the small point at the top, then your accessory is going to support that even further, and then your assistance is going to hold at the rear in that.
Yeah. So that's basically it. But if you have any questions around this, there are obviously tons of exercises that we can go through, and
tons of nuance in this as well,
and a lot of myths and misconceptions and stuff as well as far as exercise selection. But there were so many as far as like which exercises are best and bad, which ones are bad, that we didn't want to kind of bog ourselves down too much with that, because it's already going to be quite long.
Go through sort of the rules of thumb.
Yeah, but there are definitely a lot of mistakes that can be made around exercise selection, and we're happy to go through that as well if you guys want to watch that.
We've never seen someone that's good at deadlift, bench, overhead, squat, and pull-ups that isn't jacked.
That's true.
Yeah, that kind of principle.
Yeah,
primary
exactly.
movements.
If you can do those and do them well, you're probably pretty big, pretty strong.
Yeah.
So that's basically it from us today, guys. Please please subscribe, comment, smash the subscribe button, the bell notification, all that stuff. Really appreciate the feedback, appreciate the support.
Thanks for watching, guys.
Thank you, guys.
Peace.
Bye.